One of the subtleties involved in using the load method is that the type of the second argument that you pass to the load method is going to determine whether jQuery uses the get or post method in order to send the request to the server. If the argument is an object or an array, then load is going to use the HTTP post method. If the argument is a string, it's going to use the get method. Now, in many cases, you probably are not going to care which method load uses. But in general, you should use the get method when you're making repeatable requests for data, and use post when you're changing data on the server. This keeps you in compliance with web standards and, in some browsers, helps cache data more efficiently. So let's explore this issue a bit. The easiest way to see which method that load is using is with Firebug. So this is the loadContentWS.html page that I showed you just a bit ago. And I'm going to go ahead and view that in the browser, again in Firefox. I'll open up Firebug, and I'll change over to the console. Go ahead and enable it, and I'll reload the page. Okay, there we're good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click each of the Pippi links in each of these rows. And as you can see, that caused a get, that one caused a get, that one caused a get, and that one caused a post. And the final one is going to cause a post as well. The difference here is that recall that the first three sets of links pass the parameter as a string, either as part of the URL or as a string parameter to the load method. So if we come back over to the source of the page, you can see that we're passing a string, and actually I passed an empty string there because I concatenated it on to the end of the URL. So that was the first one. The second one did basically the same thing. Third one passed it once again as a string. And then finally the fourth and the fifth set of links pass it as an object literal, literally an object, a JavaScript object. All right, you see that this page is following the overall rules for how load is making that call to the web service. So with the load method, the only way to control the behavior is by providing the second argument in a format that is going to cause the method to use the HTTP verb that I want, either get or post. But controlling behavior like this with an argument type is, well, it's really pretty funky, even if it's doable. But fortunately, jQuery has better options. You can instead use the get and post methods, which are just about as easy to use as the load method, although they have their own little quirks. So let's take a look at those methods. The get and post methods are utility methods, which again means that they're implemented as methods of the jQuery method, rather than operating on a wrapped set resulting from a selector used with the jQuery method. This means that you can't use get and post to directly update a matched set of elements as you can with load. Instead, what you have to do is use each method's callback argument to define a function that takes the response and updates the page, does whatever it needs to do to update the page. The other difference between these methods and the load method is that the get and post methods use their respective HTTP get or post no matter what arguments you pass them. All right, so let's see this in action. The load content GP page is a variation of the load content WS page that I showed you just a short while ago. There are only two rows of links to dogs. The first uses the get method, and the second uses the post method to retrieve the information from the selected dog. So if you look at the source on the page, we just have two sets of links, and that div content. And here is the click event function on the div get that uses the get method. It passes in the web service and the web method that I want to call. I'm once again calling the doginfo QS, and passing this as an object literal. Then I include this function as part of the complete argument, and that function receives the response from the web server. So jQuery takes care of calling this anonymous function and passes in the response that it got from the server. And then it does the same basic thing of reading the text from that response object and then updating using the HTML method and updating the div connect object. And then here's the post method. It does pretty much the exact same thing, calls the web service in the method, in this case passes in the argument as a string, and then returns the same kind of a callback anonymous function. So a big difference between this and the earlier examples I showed you is that the get and post methods are utility methods. They're not operating on a wrapped set of elements like the load method does. Instead, I need to do that work here within this callback. In this case, I'm updating one element, but it'll update all of the elements for this match set if there happens to be more than one. Remember that if you pass an object literal to the load method, it uses a post in order to make the request. And if you use a string, it uses an HTTP GET. But in this code, this object literal is going to result in a GET because I'm using the GET method. So the GET and the POST methods use those HTTP verbs no matter what kind of argument you pass as the second parameter. And I can confirm this if I go ahead and view this in Firefox. So I'll go ahead and click on that link that uses the GET method. Notice it used the GET method even though I passed an object literal. And here I'll click there, and it uses the POST method even though I passed a parameter as a string. So now you have complete control over how jQuery makes that request at the cost of having to write a little bit extra code, that anonymous function in the callback method, in order to update whatever elements on the page that you want to update. That's not taken care of automatically as it was with the load method. Now the get and post methods have a fourth optional argument that specify how the code should treat the response body, the value of which can be XML, JSON, JSONP, script, HTML, or XML, which is passed as literal strings. And you can specify multiple types separated by a space to attempt to perform format conversions. These methods are quite a bit more flexible than the load method, although usually require a bit more code in order to implement them. All of the AJAX features in jQuery that you've learned about so far, along with other members in the library, are convenience methods that make using AJAX fairly easy for the most common scenarios. But when those convenience methods don't work for you, you can pull out the big AJAX gun in jQuery, the AJAX method. This is the method that all of the convenience methods ultimately use to make the actual call to the server. They do this by performing all of the setup necessary and setting default values for various arguments that work for the particular AJAX task at hand. You can make use of the AJAX method directly to handle the scenarios not easily handled, or not handled at all, by the convenience methods. It has deceptively simple syntaxes. There's one, and there's the other. The method, for being as powerful as it is, takes just one or two arguments, URL and options. With the first syntax option, you can pass the URL for the web service and optionally follow it with as many option settings as you need. Or you can just pass a value for the options argument, one of which could be the URL. This method is the embodiment of the saying that the devil is in the details, though. And providing the right options for what you want to do is the details that you need to wade through to make the method work for you. If you look at the documentation for the AJAX method on jQuery.com, you'll find that there are more than 30 option settings that you can use. There are a handful of options that you'll use all the time, and many more that handle various esoteric situations. There are options that let you define event functions, control the response data format, give you access to the underlying XHR object, define additional request headers, and many, many more. As you explore the options, it becomes easy to appreciate all the work that the convenience methods, such as the load method, what those methods do for you. On the other hand, it's nice to have the option to use the AJAX method directly so that you can completely control how that call is made to the server. So let's explore this AJAX method. Let's look at a simple example of using the AJAX method by rewriting the Hello World sample, which was the first AJAX sample that I showed you. That earlier sample used the load method, which calls the Hello World web service method in order to retrieve a string. So this is that original file that I showed you. So very simple and straightforward. But now here's the Hello World AJAX that uses the AJAX method directly to make the AJAX call to the server. So first of all, I'll run this just to show you that it does the exact same thing. Shut down that, get info, and you can see that it has the exact same effect. All right. But instead of the load method, it's using the AJAX method. And as you can see, this is a utility function of the jQuery function. I'm not executing this on a match set, so I'm going to have to write some sort of code within a callback in order to update any elements on the page. So the first thing it does is uses the type option in order to make a GET call and the URL option in order to specify the location of the web service. In this case, I'm using the form of the AJAX method that passes in a single parameter, in this case, an object literal. So again, this doesn't directly update a matched set of elements, so I'm going to use the success attribute, or the success option, in order to define a function that jQuery will call once it gets a successful response from the web server. And we'll look at different options that you can write code against a little bit later. All right, all this function does, it receives the response that we got back from the server, and then writes that out, takes the text value out of that response, and then uses the HTML method in order to update all of the divs on the page. So this is the code that does what the load method did in the original Hello World sample. So as you can see, using the AJAX method is definitely a little bit more complex than using the load method, both because you have to provide the appropriate option values, as well as because the method doesn't directly update a matched set of elements. You have to write a function for the success event in order to update the page. All right, so let's now look at another example that's a bit more complex and a bit more realistic. Come over here and open up the Burrows page. And I'll go ahead and view that page. All right, so I get this very simple page with a header and a button. When I click on the button, it uses the AJAX method to go out and retrieve some information about Alaska burrows. Very simple and straightforward. I can click it again, but I just get the same results. All right, once again, the body section of the page is very simple. It just has those three elements, the header, the button, and then an element to receive the updated content. All right, back up here is the code that it uses. And in this case, it calls the getAllBurrows web service method. So just to remind you what that is all about, that uses that burrow class with the name, population, created. It instantiates a list object called burrows with information about 5 of the burrows in Alaska. And then it just simply returns that .NET list object, generic list object, to the client. All right, then within the page itself, here's the code that takes care of making that call. So it's going to wire up the click event function of that button and use the AJAX method. The method is going to use a post call to the specified URL, and it's going to provide an empty object literal as the data for the method. This particular method doesn't require any data, so we don't need to pass anything in. The content that it wants back is JSON. And that's specified both in the content type as well as the data type options. All right, then the success option defines an event function in order to update the page. And this is a little bit more complex. It first of all starts out by updating the div result and then appending to it a paragraph with some information as well as the opening unordered list element. And that has the ID of borough list. All right, so this statement is clearing out the result and then appending a piece of static text to it. And then I need to loop through that set of boroughs that is retrieved. And to get that, I use the response.d property. And then I can loop through that, and because that's JSON, it's a format that JavaScript understands. It's a native JavaScript format. And so it goes through, loops through each of the boroughs, going up to the borough's length, and then appending onto that borough list element that I created dynamically in memory right here, it appends a list item and reads various properties of that borough's object. Reads the name with a colon, population, people, created in, created, and closes out that list item. All right, then it finishes up by setting the display property of that div result to block. Makes it visible. One of the interesting things about this code, besides the fact that it uses the AJAX method, is that you can see how you're not limited to appending items in order to update or add HTML to elements that were on the original page that was loaded when you first brought up the page within the browser. Okay, so once again, you can see that it's a little bit more complex. Certainly possible to do this sort of thing. The convenience methods would fall a little bit short. You'd have you'd have to write a fair bit of code to try and get the convenience methods to do what you can do within the AJAX method. Now, the number of options that you set for the AJAX method is highly dependent on what you need to accomplish with the method call. Remember that the web method didn't have anything in it that told it that a client would want JSON data. The AJAX method requested the data in that format, and the web method delivered it. And you can go ahead and verify that. So if I go ahead and view this page again, I can open up Firebug. And click on Get Boroughs. And you can see that I get the list of boroughs. It was a post. And I can expand that and take a look at the actual response that I received. And this is the JSON format. Okay? And you can drill down in here and actually look at the different objects and collections within that response. But here's the raw response. As you begin using the AJAX method a lot in a website, you're going to very quickly find that each invocation uses many of the same options over and over again to fine-tune each request. This can make using the AJAX method unwieldy and pretty complicated, somewhat out of nature for the jQuery library. Because, quite frankly, we've been looking at fairly simple examples, and there's a lot more options that you can use in order to fine-tune it. But there's a pretty good chance that many of the option values for the various uses of the method throughout a site are set to the same value, particularly the URL, type, data type, and content type options. Once again, jQuery rises to the occasion and provides a nice AJAX setup utility method that lets you set global options for all AJAX method invocations while those options are in effect. The method takes pretty much all of the same options as the AJAX method itself, and the settings apply whenever you use the AJAX method. So let's take a look at how you can use this in order to save a fair amount of typing when you're using the AJAX method. This boroughsettings.html page refactors the code from the boroughs.html page in order to use the AJAX setup method. It overall does the exact same thing as that other page. But it uses AJAX setup to set in advance various options for the AJAX method. So here, as you can see, I've extracted the type option, URL, data, content type, and data type. And then when I actually call the method, so this doesn't actually make any kind of call to the server. It's just setting up the AJAX method. But then when I'm ready to call the method from the client, all I need to do is provide values either that change the value for any of these options or add additional options. And in this case, I've kept the success option here within the AJAX method because it's pretty likely that this function that executes when you successfully get the callback from the AJAX method from the server is going to be specific to each use of the AJAX method. But I just as easily could have defined the success within the AJAX setup up here, and then all I would need to do is call the AJAX method with no parameters. So you have a lot of flexibility. And quite frankly, as you get deeper and deeper into using the AJAX method and you start really exercising a lot of the options, this is going to make a big difference for how efficiently or how much time it takes to write all the code to execute the AJAX method. All right, so I'll go ahead and run this just to show you it does the exact same thing. And we have the get burrows, and we get the exact same JSON result. So it's doing the exact same thing as the previous version of the page, the burrows.html page. Now, it's not going to be real often that you call AJAX setup here within a single page, unless you have many invocations of AJAX within this one page. More typically, you'll call AJAX setup in a master or layout page so that the settings apply to all uses of the AJAX method in the site, because it's pretty likely that you're going to be calling the same URL, if not the same method itself. And then the sample page could have simplified the AJAX method even further, as I mentioned, by including the success option in AJAX setup. Best of all, you can easily override any of the global settings for a single invocation just by setting the option to a different value in the AJAX method call. So in the sample page, the code could have overwritten the URL option to call a different web method. In that case, jQuery will use all of the other option settings, but throw this one away and use the one that you defined here within the actual AJAX method call. This really is a pretty simple and elegant way to help simplify your custom jQuery code. There are a number of global and local events that are raised at various points during an AJAX call to the server. And you can insert custom code that executes at those different event points. You can handle local events using callback functions defined within the AJAX method call. And there's several different options, and I'll list them here in the order in which they occur. The first one is before send. The AJAX method invokes this prior to initiating an AJAX request. You could modify the XHR object or cancel the request in this event function. Then there's an error event, and that's invoked when the AJAX request results in an error response. You get some sort of an error back from the server. Then there's the complete event, and that's invoked when the AJAX request completes, whether it succeeded or failed with an error. This event is always going to execute. And then finally, there's the one that you saw in the previous examples, success, which is invoked when an AJAX request returns a response without an error. All right, you've seen several examples of these callback methods in various examples, including, like I said, the Alaska Burrows pages that use the success object. Then there are global events. Global events are those that any element on the page can respond to. You can bind one or more elements to these global events using either the jQuery bind method or any of several different convenience methods. And once again, I'm listing these in the order in which the events normally fire. AJAX start is broadcast when an AJAX request starts, and there are no other already pending AJAX requests. So essentially, the AJAX infrastructure is gearing up and firing up. Then there's the AJAX send. This is broadcast before each AJAX request that you make. So you might have several AJAX send events for each AJAX start. And then you have AJAX success, and this is broadcast when an individual AJAX request got a successful response from the server without any kind of error response. Then there's the AJAX error, which is broadcast when the AJAX request results in an error response from the server. And then there's the AJAX complete, which is broadcast each time that an AJAX request finishes, whether it was successful or not. And then the final event is AJAX stop. This is broadcast when the last pending AJAX request is complete. So this is the closing event to the AJAX start event. All right, so let's explore the behavior of these local and global events. Here's the AJAX events.html sample page. And this is an exploration of AJAX events using the AJAX method. So I'll go ahead and fire it up so you can see what it does. Close that for the moment. So when you first load the page, you just have this header and 3 different buttons, because the 3 different buttons cause different combinations of global and local events to fire. So when the user clicks on one of the buttons, it displays all of the events that fired in response to that button click. So this first button fires only global events. The second fires both global and local events. And the third calls a non-existent web service method to include the error events in the list, and it includes both global and local events. All right, so as you can see, I called that Hello World web service 4 times. So I wanted to include multiple invocations here. So as you can see, immediately before the first request goes out, the AJAX start event fired, and then a send event for each of those 4 requests. And then, as a response is received back from the server, we get a success event and then a complete event for each of those 4 invocations. Success complete, success complete, success complete. Once there are no pending AJAX requests, then we get the AJAX stop event. Now the thing to keep in mind is that all AJAX requests are asynchronous by default. Back when AJAX was an acronym, the A stood for asynchronous. All right, so all 4 of the requests are sent, fired off all at once, and then the code sits there and waits for the different responses. And then just to show what actually happened, it displays the response from each of those invocations of the web method. Okay, if you fire the global and local events, you get a lot more events. So you can see that the first event is still AJAX start, but then there's a local event before send that is fired before that send event occurs. And that happens for each of the 4 invocations. And so now at this point, we're just sitting waiting for a response from the web server. And then you can see as we get a response, the success local event fires, and then the global event fires, and then finally the complete event fires. And then we also get the AJAX complete event. So you can see that as we get each response, we're getting 4 events that we can write code against. And that happens for each of the 4 invocations. And as you can see, we have Hello World 5, 6, 7, and 8 this time. And that continues on down. We get the final AJAX complete. There's no pending requests. And once again, the AJAX stop event fires. All right, now I'll click the Fire All Events with Error. So in this case, we got no response because we're actually calling a non-existent web method on the server. So once again, the AJAX start method fired, before send and AJAX send fired for each of the 4 requests. But this time, we got an AJAX error event because it couldn't find the web method. The complete event and AJAX complete events both fire because these fire when the request is complete, whether or not it was a successful request. And then, once again, we get the same cycle here. We get the error and AJAX error, complete and AJAX complete, and so forth. And then finally, we get the AJAX stop because we have no further pending requests. Now the thing to notice here is that the fire all events with error produces the same number of events as all of the global and local events. All we're doing is we're substituting the AJAX error and error local for the success and AJAX success. So we're either going to get an error event of the two types, local and global, or we're going to get a success event, the equivalent success events. All right, so we can come back over to the code. Here's the body of the page. As you can see, it's mostly the buttons. But then we have the div return, and that's where it displays the return values of that series of calls, and then the list of events. All right, so the first set of code in the page binds the global events to the body elements on the page. So I'm using the jQuery bind method, passing in a space-delimited list of all of the global methods that I want to associate with this body element, and then defining an anonymous function that gets event information and then updates the div events, appends all of this data, including the time, as well as event type and the fact that it fired. So that's what's generating those events on the page for each of the events. So it's important to realize that you can define multiple events, again, delimited by spaces. And all of these are going to share the custom event function defined in the second argument. Now, this is a little bit unusual. First of all, I'm probably not going to very often write event code for all of these objects. But if I needed to execute different code for each of these events, then I could use the bind method multiple times and bind each of these events to a different function that executes. Now, one of the things this code does is it uses this date format function. This is defined in the date.format.js script that I've included on the page here. This is a handy function from Stephen Leffethan under the very liberal MIT license that provides many date and time formatting options. JavaScript just doesn't have enough support for doing this. You can write your own code, but this date.format function is very handy. So the time format on the page, as I note at the bottom of the page in the results, is defined with this mask right here. Okay, so the next bit of JavaScript code here defines an event function for the AJAX stop event that displays the time format at the bottom of the list of events once all of the AJAX requests have completed. This code uses the AJAX stop method in order to define the event function, which is an alternative way to the bind method that I showed you in the previous code example. Because AJAX stop is the very last event to fire after all pending requests are completed, the note about the time format is going to be the last item in the list after all of the events in the div events element. Again, that's why that appears at the end of the list. Now notice that the code at this point has now defined two event functions for AJAX stop. I bound one right here and the second one right here. The page is going to execute the event functions in the order that I've defined them on the page. So this makes it a handy way to handle the kind of scenario where I want to display something after a list of other items. Okay, next chunk of code sets up a shared click event function for all of the buttons on the page. And this just uses the simple button selector. It starts by saving the ID of the button that caused this click event to fire, and it clears out the div events and div return. And in order to keep the list of events at the same location on the page, I don't just clear it with an empty string, I clear it with a non-breaking space. That's why if I come back over to the page and go back and forth, and when this goes away, these events don't shift up when there's nothing displayed here. So it just makes it a little bit easier, particularly between these two buttons, to show that they're getting the same number of events. Okay, this next bit of code in these few lines uses the AJAX setup method in order to set the URL option for the AJAX method call. This is a variation of using the AJAX setup, because what I can do is, if the ID of the button is button error, it's that third button on the page, I want to call a non-existent method. Otherwise, I want to call that hello world method. So this is handy because now in the AJAX function down here, I don't have to define multiple versions of this, which are basically going to be completely redundant, other than the URL property. I can just go ahead and call the AJAX method, and it's going to use whatever URL is linked to the button that was clicked. All right, the rest of the code sets up a loop in order to execute the web service method 4 times. So it's just going to loop through and make 4 calls to this AJAX method. I did this just to make it easier to see the interrelationship between different types of methods, and to show that, for example, the AJAX start method fires only once for a group of AJAX calls. So it sets the type and global options, and then defines custom event functions for before send, complete, error, and success. Each of the functions follows the same pattern of appending the time and event string for the button all events and button error buttons, which is why these local events don't appear when you click the first button, button global events. Okay, so it's checking to see that we're clicking one of the 2 buttons that I want to record these local events for. And then the success function also adds the AJAX response to the list of responses, since it's the event that fires when the page gets a successful response from the server. So here is where I'm appending that response text to that div at the top of the page, immediately below the buttons. And then, same as the other events here, it appends the event to the list of events.